In August 2013, a 26-year-old father named Brandon Lawson disappeared on a dark stretch of highway 277 inches rural Texas. His truck was found abandoned, doors unlocked, wallet and keys still inside. 20 minutes earlier, he'd called 911, his voice steady but urgent. He said he was being chased. Then the line went dead. For 9 years, searchers combed the same field while his family waited for answers. When his remains were finally found in 2022, just a few hundred feet from where the truck had been, the case was quietly marked, closed, no press release, no cause of death. Yet the question still lingers, whispered across recordings, reports, and the Texas wind itself. Why did the authorities end the investigation without explanation? Join us as we retrace the calls, the search, and the silence that turned a single night on Highway 277 into one of Texas's most haunting disappearances. Vanished on a rural highway. The night of the 8th of August 2013 unfolded quietly along US Highway 277, just north of San Angelo, Texas. The stretch of road was familiar to those who drove oil trucks and farm equipment at late hours, but to one man, it would become the end of a path no one fully understands. That man was Brandon Lawson, 26 years old, father of 4, an oil field worker from Crowley. He disappeared that night after a series of phone calls, a 911 recording that remains unsettling, and a search that stretched across years. When Texas authorities finally closed the case in 2022, no formal explanation was ever given. It began late on a Thursday evening. Around 11:53 p.m., Brandon left his home after a brief argument with his longtime partner, Ladessa Lofton. He told her he was driving to his father's house in Fort Worth, roughly 3 hours away. His white F-150 pickup carried only a small amount of fuel, and his phone battery was already low. Before leaving, he called his brother, Kyle Lawson, saying he would stop for gas on the way. The route he took north through Bronte toward Abilene was mostly rural, with long stretches of dark road between small towns. At 12:30 a.m., Kyle received another call. Brandon said he had run out of gas near the town of Bronte. Kyle offered to bring fuel and left home shortly after. Around that same time, multiple 911 dispatchers in Coke County received a call from Brandon himself. His words were frantic but hard to decipher. The call lasted 3 seconds. Parts of the recording are clear, others are distorted. He says, "Yes, I'm in the middle of the field. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. The guy's chasing me into the woods. Please hurry." The dispatcher asks for his location, but his voice breaks up. He mentions, "We ran into them," and repeats that he needs help. The call ends abruptly. When Carl arrived about 15 minutes later, he found Brandon's truck parked partly on the shoulder, partly in a lane of traffic near the Colorado River Bridge on Highway 277. The driver's door was unlocked. Inside were Brandon's keys, wallet, and phone charger. There was no sign of him. A sheriff's deputy also stopped at the scene, unaware of the earlier 911 call. Believing the truck was simply abandoned, he arranged for a tow and moved on. Kyle, thinking Brandon might be hiding nearby, called out into the darkness. At 12:56 a.m., his phone rang Brandon again. The call lasted less than a minute. According to Kyle, his brother sounded panicked and said, "I'm bleeding." The line went dead. For the next several hours, Kyle and the deputy searched the immediate area with flashlights, but found nothing. No tracks, no signs of struggle, no dropped items. Kyle later said he thought Brandon might have been hiding from law enforcement due to an outstanding warrant, which may explain why he didn't approach the officer for help. Still, that doesn't explain the strange 911 call or the sense that someone was chasing him. As daylight came, Coke County deputies and local volunteers combed the area near the river, the highway, and nearby pastures. The land there is rough fields of scrub, mesquite, and cactus stretching for miles. Rattlesnakes, barbed wire, and heat complicate every search. They found only footprints leading toward a fence line, then stopping near the edge of private ranch property. Bloodhounds were brought in, but lost the scent within minutes. In the following days, searchers expanded the grid north and west of the truck's position. Helicopters and ATVs covered open terrain. No clothing, blood, or personal items were discovered. The truck itself was towed and examined. No damage, no signs of forced entry, and no physical evidence of another vehicle. The only clue remained that distorted emergency call, its words debated for years. Audio analysts later slowed and filtered the recording. Some listeners hear, "There's one car here, "They pushed some guys over." Others insist it says, "They chased me." Each version changes the meaning. What is known for certain is that he mentioned being in a field and needing help. The sheriff's office initially considered it a missing person case rather than foul play. By the end of August 2013, active searches ended. His family conducted their own efforts, hiring private teams with drones and cadaver dogs. Still, nothing surfaced. For years, social media amplified speculation. Some believed Brandon had been disoriented from exhaustion or substances and collapsed somewhere unseen. Others believed he encountered someone on the highway that night, perhaps a passerby or another driver, and fled into the darkness. In February 2022, nearly 9 years later, a volunteer search group called Adventures with Purpose joined a renewed investigation. Local deputies reopened sections of land near the original site. In February 2022, partial human remains were located approximately 100 yards from where the truck had been found, across rough brush near the riverbank. Clothing consistent with what Brandon was wearing, a pair of shorts, shoes, and shirt fragments were nearby. DNA analysis confirmed the remains belonged to Brandon Lawson. Authorities released no detailed report. The official statement only said that the remains were identified and the case was considered closed. No autopsy results, cause of death, or further explanation were publicly given. Family members said they were not told whether foul play was ruled out. The Texas Rangers, who briefly assisted, issued no independent statement. Even with the discovery, questions linger. Why did the 911 call sound like someone was chasing him? Why did his brother hear him say he was bleeding? Why did deputies that night not link the stranded truck to the distress call made from the same area minutes earlier? Some reports suggest that Brandon crossed a barbed wire fence and collapsed in tall grass only a short distance from the road, close enough that searchers likely passed within yards of him multiple times. The landscape offers one explanation. That stretch of highway near Bronte is uneven, with rolling terrain, gullies, and tall weeds that can hide a person even a few feet away. At night, with flashlights cutting narrow beams through dust and brush, visibility drops sharply. The temperature that evening hovered around 90 degrees, dropping suddenly before dawn. Heat, dehydration, and exhaustion could have led to confusion or collapse. Others still believe something else occurred, that the one car he mentioned was real, and whoever was in it may have frightened or pursued him. But without clear evidence, those details remain suspended between interpretation and static. The final pages of the case file are brief. Remains identified as Brandon Lawson. The note reads, "Case closed." No further explanation, no reconstruction of events. The silence that began with his final call extends into the record itself. Empty spaces, blank margins, unanswered lines. Years later, travelers on Highway 277 still slow as they pass the marker near the bridge. The field remains the same: low mesquite, dry grass, wind moving through wire fences. The sound of tires over asphalt replaces the voice once carried on that line. Somewhere between confusion and distance, Brandon Lawson's final words echo unresolved, half-heard, and still unexplained. The call that no one understood. The 911 recording made by Brandon Lawson at 12:50 a.m. on the 9th of August 2013 lasts 43 seconds. It is the heart of the mystery, the one artifact that still feels alive. Deputies, audio technicians, journalists, and family members have all replayed it for years, each hearing something slightly different. On the official log, it is labelled incoherent, divided by distress call from male subject near Bronte. Yet to those who have listened closely, the call seems filled with meaning: panic, pursuit, and perhaps a final clue to what really happened on that dark Texas highway. The dispatcher's transcript reads in fragments. Brandon's voice is faint, winded. "Yes, I'm in the middle of the field," he begins. "My truck ran out of gas." A pause follows, then several garbled words. "There's one car here. The guy's chasing me into the woods." The line crackles. A burst of static breaks through. "Please hurry," he says. After that, silence. The dispatcher's voice is calm and professional, asking for a location, but there is no response. She repeats the question twice before the signal cuts completely. Minutes later, the Coke County Sheriff's Office received another brief note through the 911 system cell tower data, placing the call roughly between the towns of Bronte and Tennyson, near the Colorado River Bridge on Highway 277. Coverage there is patchy. One tower serves miles of uneven land. The dispatcher radioed patrol units to check for a stranded motorist. No one connected that call to Brandon by name. His brother Kyle, driving toward him at that same moment, was unaware that his sibling had just placed a call for help. Investigators later compared the original analog recording to a cleaned digital version. The sound of wind against the phone's receiver dominates, a constant rush of air and static. Some portions carry faint metallic echoes, as if he were moving or breathing hard. The background suggests open terrain, no engine noise, no clear traffic sounds. Specialists from law enforcement audio labs attempted to filter it, enhancing mid-range frequencies to isolate syllables. They produced multiple interpretations, none conclusive. To understand why the message remains contested, consider the variables. Cell signals that night bounced between towers, producing packet loss and overlapping echoes. When words dropped out, digital compressions stretched what remained, changing vowel shapes and consonant edges. Background noise, cicadas, wind, and distant cars filled those gaps with false tones. Every listener since has brought expectation to the task, some hearing fear, others confusion, others the sound of a man misreading his surroundings. In 2014, amateur analysts online began trading slowed versions of the clip. Some heard, "We ran into them," suggesting a collision or confrontation. Others believed it said, "They ran into me," implying pursuit. A few insisted the phrase was, "We're out here going toward Abilene." Each transcription created a new branch of theory. The sheriff's office reviewed them all but declined to endorse any. Officially, the report summarized it as unintelligible distress, possible pursuit, location uncertain. Dispatchers who handled the call later said that Brandon's tone, not his words, made them treat it as serious. He was not slurring. He sounded coherent but frightened. One recalled, "It wasn't a prank. You can hear him breathing, moving fast." Something was happening out there. Yet when deputies arrived 20 minutes later, the scene appeared ordinary. A truck without gas, doors unlocked, no sign of violence. The mismatch between the urgency of the call and the stillness of the location has shaped every discussion since. Audio technicians who studied the file note that background silence at the end is abrupt, suggesting he released the phone or lost signal suddenly. In that final second, a faint clicking sound, possibly brush against the microphone, appears before the line dies. Some believe that moment marks when he entered thick vegetation or fell. Others argue it's simply the signal collapsing as he moved beyond coverage. The 911 call also raised procedural questions. The dispatcher had asked for cross streets, but Highway 277 runs long and unbroken. Without a nearby landmark, locating him required triangulation. Early that morning, with minimal staff, Coke County did not have real-time cell ping tracing capability. By the time they identified the tower radius, the area spanned nearly 26 square miles. The first responding deputy checked only visible pull-offs along the highway. Brandon's truck sat just beyond one of those curves, lights off, easy to miss in darkness. When the recording was later made public, Brandon's family hoped its release would draw new leads. Instead, it divided listeners. Online forums dissected every second spectrograms, waveforms, slowed replays at half speed. A popular interpretation claims he said, "I ran into somebody, then I need the cops." Another isolates a whispered phrase, "I'm bleeding." The official transcript includes neither. The Texas Department of Public Safety, which briefly reviewed the case, stated that environmental interference made definitive transcription impossible. For context, similar rural 911 calls in West Texas often suffer from multi-path distortion signals bouncing between cell towers before converging. Investigators recreated the conditions by driving the same route with identical phone models. They found that sudden drops in elevation near the river bridge caused seconds-long gaps and bursts of noise identical to those on Brandon's call. The result suggests technical, not supernatural, corruption, but it cannot explain his words. The family retained an independent engineer from Dallas to clean the recording again in 2019 using newer software. His conclusion was cautious. The speaker appears lucid, speaking English, reporting distress, possibly referencing pursuit by unknown persons. No indication of background voices. That last detail counters theories that a second person can be faintly heard. Wave analysis showed no overlapping speech patterns beyond normal echo. Yet dispatch records that night show at least two other motorists called to report a truck partially blocking the lane near the Colorado River Bridge. One caller told the deputy he saw a man walking toward the trees. When asked later if he had heard shouting, he said no. Those separate accounts, when aligned with the timestamp of Brandon's 911 call, imply that whatever frightened him occurred minutes before others reached that spot. Years later, investigators replayed the recording for new recruits as an example of ambiguous communication. One former sheriff said, "It teaches you how much can be lost in 40 seconds. Another officer privately admitted, "We should have treated it as a rescue right away. Instead, it looked like another broken-down truck. The failure to link the distress call to the vehicle until hours later likely erased any chance of finding him alive." The tape remains archived in multiple formats: analog, digital, and online copies of varying quality. Each generation of reproduction adds slight distortion, so no version is perfectly faithful to the original. The earliest reel, stored in Coke County evidence files, has never been released publicly. Listeners only know the compressed reproduction circulated by family advocates. For all its noise, the recording has become a mirror. People hear in it what they fear most. Some hear criminal pursuit, others panic and disorientation. The dispatcher's steady voice contrasts sharply with Brandon's uneven breaths, a pattern that feels human, immediate, and unresolved. When authorities finally announced the discovery of his remains in 2022, they gave no clarification of the recording's contents. The official summary still reads, "Caller stated he was being chased. Call terminated before location obtained. Nothing more." Late at night, those who travel Highway 277 sometimes play the clip through car speakers as they pass the old bridge. The wind and static seem to merge with the open air, blurring then and now. His words, whatever they truly were, still echo there, half-formed, carried by the same weak signal that never reached help. The search in the dark. When the sun rose over Coke County on the 9th of August 2013, the quiet ranchland north of Bronte became a staging ground for one of Texas's strangest search operations. A pickup truck sat on the shoulder of Highway 277, its gas tank empty, doors unlocked, and driver missing. Deputies believed it was a routine breakdown. Only hours later would they learn that the truck's owner, 26-year-old Brandon Lawson, had called 911 minutes before vanishing, saying someone was chasing him. What followed was a search marked by confusion, heat, and small mistakes that multiplied over time. Deputy Neil Calvert was the first officer on scene around 1 a.m. He had been dispatched after reports of a truck obstructing the lane near the Colorado River Bridge. When he arrived, he found Brandon's brother, Kyle, already there. The two men spoke briefly. Kyle explained that his brother had run out of gas and called for help. The deputy shined his flashlight into the cab. The keys, wallet, and phone charger were visible inside, but there was no phone, no driver, and no sign of struggle. Calvert scanned the roadside for footprints. He saw only a few indistinct impressions leading toward a barbed wire fence and assumed Brandon had walked off to find a gas station. Kyle thought the same. The officer offered to wait for the tow truck while Kyle returned home to get fuel. That moment, one man leaving and the other treating the case as a simple stall would define the critical gap in the search. Minutes later, Kyle tried to call Brandon again. This time, the call went through. Brandon whispered that he was 10 minutes up the road, then said something Kyle could not make out. The line clicked and died. When Kyle returned with gasoline, around 3 a.m., the deputy had already left. The truck remained. Brandon was gone. At sunrise, Ladessa Lofton, Brandon's longtime partner, contacted the sheriff's office to report him missing. The dispatcher cross-referenced the previous night's calls and realized the abandoned truck matched the location of the unknown 911 distress call. That discovery triggered a formal search. By mid-morning, deputies, volunteers, and a local tracking team assembled near the bridge. They began sweeping fields east and west of the highway, walking in narrow lines. The land rolled unevenly, dotted with mesquite and cactus. Thorny brush tore at clothing, and summer heat climbed past 95 degrees. They found footprints on the north side of the fence, leading toward a tree line, but lost them within yards. Search dogs arrived from Abilene in the afternoon. Handlers started near the truck, giving them a scent sample from Brandon's hat found inside. The dogs followed a trail through tall grass toward the river, then veered north, circling before stopping near a patch of dense weeds. One dog sat and refused to move forward. Handlers marked the area, believing Brandon might have rested there, yet repeated passes produced nothing: no clothing, no blood, no objects. That evening, volunteers on ATVs scouted ranch roads extending several miles outward. The terrain was vast and mostly private. Landowners opened gates, letting searchers pass through pastures and dry creek beds. A helicopter from San Angelo circled overhead using thermal imaging, but found no heat signatures consistent with a person. By sunset, the official search radius extended more than 2 miles from the highway. Meanwhile, deputies questioned passing drivers. One trucker said he had seen a man walking along the fence line around 12:45 a.m., shirtless, holding a phone. Another motorist remembered a figure darting toward the trees as headlights approached. None could confirm identity in the darkness. No one reported hearing screams or shots. The accounts placed a lone man moving north, then disappearing between the brush and river. By the second day, August 10, the search widened. Deputies traced both sides of the Colorado River, checking low banks where a person might have slipped or collapsed. Water levels were shallow, the current slow. Divers waded through deeper pockets, but found no remains. Heat and exhaustion slowed progress. After 48 hours, officials scaled back, active searching, citing lack of evidence and dangerous temperatures. Privately, family members continued combing the area. Kyle and Ledessa organized volunteers with four-wheelers and horses. They printed flyers, contacted hospitals, and checked county jails. Some believed Brandon had fled to avoid an outstanding warrant. Others feared foul play. Yet the sheriff maintained the same line. No signs of struggle, no indication of another vehicle. Over the following week, inconsistencies surfaced. The initial deputy's report made no mention of the 911 call because it had not yet been linked to the truck. That omission delayed classification of the scene as a potential emergency. The area directly beyond the barbed wire fence, where later remains would be found, was never thoroughly searched in the first 24 hours. Volunteers had assumed deputies covered it. Deputies believed it was private land already checked. Night searches revealed another complication: cell coverage gaps. Call logs from Brandon's carrier showed multiple attempted connections to 911, his brother, and Ledessa between 12:50 and 1:10 a.m., all dropping within seconds. That pattern indicates he was moving through weak signal zones, possibly disoriented, repeatedly trying to call. The last outgoing attempt pinged the same tower as the first. After that, silence. For weeks, his family returned. In late August, a private search group from Midland used infrared cameras and grid mapping. They noted the thick undergrowth along the river and the steep drop-offs hidden behind tall grass. The land's contour made line of sight searching almost impossible. Without aerial drones, which were uncommon, then large swaths went uninspected. By September, the official case file measured only a few pages. Missing person, vehicle impounded, no foul play suspected. The sheriff wrote, "Subject possibly left area on foot. Investigation continues." It would remain unchanged for nearly 9 years. Looking back, investigators admit the early hours shaped the outcome. The assumption that the stranded truck was harmless, the lack of coordination between dispatch and patrol, and the harsh terrain combined to bury evidence almost immediately. Even when later teams returned with advanced gear, the landscape had shifted: grass overgrown, fences replaced, riverbed altered by seasonal floods. When remains were finally located in 2022, roughly 100 yards from the truck's original position, searchers realized how close he had been all along. It is likely he crossed the fence, stumbled through weeds, and collapsed unseen in the dark. But in those first 48 hours, with flashlights sweeping only open ground, that narrow pocket of brush was missed. Today, the stretch of Highway 277 looks unchanged: miles of tan grass and quiet fences. Travelers rarely know that just beyond the wire lies the ground where dozens once searched under a burning sky, calling a name that would not answer. The search, like the voice on the 911 line, faded into static, swallowed by distance and time. The theories that wouldn't die. When the last official search ended, the silence around Brandon Lawson's disappearance became its own kind of noise. In the years that followed, law enforcement reports remained thin, bare facts about a stranded truck, a missing man, and a recovered body nearly a decade later. But online, in living rooms, and across Texas radio frequencies, theories grew louder. Some pointed to drugs and exhaustion, others saw proof of foul play hidden behind procedural indifference. Between them stood a 43-second recording, interpreted 100 different ways, yet never clarified. The first theory, the simplest, claims Brandon died from exposure. He had been awake for nearly 24 hours, arguing at home, possibly under stress. His brother told police he believed Brandon had recently used methamphetamine a detail later repeated in reports. Those who knew him said it wasn't regular behavior, but even mild disorientation could have driven panic. The terrain near the Colorado River Bridge is rugged, uneven rock, snake dens, and gullies deep enough to trap a person unseen. In this version, Brandon left the truck, fled from what he thought was danger, crossed the barbed wire fence, and collapsed within minutes. This explanation fits certain facts. His phone dropped signal in the same area where his remains were later found. The weather that night, hot, humid, and windless, would quickly drain energy from anyone running through thick brush. The 911 call, then, becomes the voice of someone frightened but confused, interpreting darkness, animals, or noises as threats. His statement, "There's one car here," may refer simply to a passing vehicle he mistook for pursuit. His brother's later recollection of hearing "I'm bleeding" might indicate scrapes from barbed wire or cactus. To investigators, this remains the most probable chain of events. Panic, exhaustion, heat, collapse, and death, only yards from safety. The second theory centers on foul play. It builds from the same uncertainty, but reads menace into every silence. Proponents note that Brandon said, "The guy's chasing me into the woods," not "I'm lost." They emphasize that his phone and keys were missing when the truck was found, and that his wallet remained untouched, suggesting he fled quickly, leaving essential items behind. Some claim the headlights of another vehicle were seen near the bridge that night, though this was never confirmed by deputies. Local residents remember that the area near Highway 277 has long been a corridor for drug transport and transient traffic. The idea that he might have encountered someone dangerous while stranded is not far-fetched. Online researchers mapped distances between gas stations, ranch gates, and pull-off points, concluding there was a small window between 12:45 and 1:00 a.m. when another driver could have stopped without being noticed. In this version, Brandon's 911 call is a real-time account of confrontation, not confusion. Supporters of this theory point to the final phrase, "Please hurry," as proof he sensed imminent harm. But the case file weakens that argument. Deputies found no tire marks near the truck, no footprints suggesting multiple people, and no reports of suspicious vehicles that night. The sheriff later stated there was no physical indication of foul play. Still, many find the coincidence his sudden panic and total disappearance too much to accept as misadventure. The third theory focuses on communication failure and law enforcement error. It does not claim murder or drugs, only that Brandon's disappearance could have been prevented. Dispatch never connected the distress call to the stranded vehicle until daylight. The deputy who found the truck was never told that a 911 caller in the same area had described being chased. Without that knowledge, he assumed the driver had simply walked away. In rural departments, such gaps are common. Calls are handled by regional centers serving several counties. By the time information circulates, hours can pass. To critics, this oversight cost the only chance to rescue him alive. Within this view, the tragedy is procedural, not criminal. Brandon's remains were later discovered a short distance beyond the fence, close enough that a coordinated search that night might have found him. Instead, he lay hidden through seasons, weather, and neglect. The fourth, and least tangible theory, sustained mostly by internet forums, reads something extraordinary into the static. These are the listeners who slow the 911 tape to half speed, claiming to hear distant voices, a gunshot, or even multiple speakers. None of these interpretations withstand analysis. Audio engineers reviewing the original file found no secondary speech patterns or weapon discharges, only overlapping echoes caused by digital compression. Yet the persistence of such beliefs shows how the unknown invites invention. For nearly a decade, speculation kept the case alive when official files did not. Online groups like the Brandon Lawson missing community organized timelines, synchronized phone records, and created satellite overlays of the area. They plotted every call, message, and sighting, building a map of possibilities that reached far beyond Coke County. These efforts brought awareness, but also confusion, hundreds of unverified claims about new clues, sightings, and confessions. Law enforcement monitored, but rarely responded. When remains were identified in 2022, some theories collapsed, others simply shifted. Skeptics questioned how a full skeletal recovery, so near the highway, could have gone unseen for years. Search teams had passed the same zone multiple times. Did floodwaters move the bones from another site? Were they buried and later exposed? The official statement remains consistent with the missing person, case closed, answered none of these. For Brandon's family, theories have offered little comfort. Ledessa said in interviews that she accepted his death as accidental, but still resented the lack of explanation. His brother Kyle believes the evidence supported exhaustion, not foul play. His father said, "If they'd searched harder that night, we'd have known years ago. The investigation remains technically complete, but its silence feels unfinished. No timeline, no final report, only recovery and closure on paper." Today, each theory remains suspended like dust over the same stretch of land. The accident theory satisfies logic, but not emotion. The foul play theory comforts those who need an enemy to blame. The error theory reminds others how easily a life can slip through gaps in procedure. And the supernatural interpretations, voices, shadows, mysterious cars, persist because absence itself demands imagination. In the end, all four converge at the same quiet place, a field along Highway 277, 30 miles north of San Angelo, where wind moves through dry grass and cell towers blink in the distance. Whatever happened between Brandon's 911 call and his last breath remains unrecorded, only guessed. The theories continue because the silence invites them. The evidence ledger. The investigation into Brandon Lawson's disappearance produced very little physical evidence. Yet what was found or not found has become a long record of questions. In a case without witnesses, the objects left behind carry the weight of proof. The truck, the phone records, the footprints, and the recovered remains together form what law enforcement called the ledger. It is sparse but haunting, a paper trail of things that exist and things that should. At the center of it is the white Ford F-150, parked along Highway 277. The truck was positioned oddly, half on the shoulder, half in the southbound lane, its hazard lights off. Inside, deputies found Brandon's wallet, containing identification and debit cards, a phone charger, and his work keys. The driver's side door was unlocked. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no broken glass, no evidence of forced entry. The fuel gauge read empty, confirming his earlier call for help. To investigators, it looked like a standard roadside breakdown, but the small details complicated that assumption. His cell phone was gone. So were the ignition keys. The location of the truck itself, partially in the lane, suggested it stopped abruptly, as if he had pulled over in haste. Tire marks showed a short swerve before rest. One deputy later said, "It didn't look like a controlled stop. It looked like he just ran out right there." From that single point, investigators built the rest of the ledger. Around the truck, they found a few partial footprints in loose soil heading toward a barbed wire fence. The impressions were faint, made by worn shoes, and disappeared in thicker grass beyond the ditch. No matching prints were found returning toward the truck. It was the only clear direction he took away from the road. The phone records add a second layer to the ledger. Between 12:34 and 1:10 a.m., Brandon made at least 6 calls, to his brother Kyle, to Ledessa, and to 911. Only one, the emergency call, lasted more than a few seconds. The rest were incomplete connections, dropping mid-ring or ending without sound. Each pinged the same cell tower southeast of Bronte, which covered roughly a 15-mile radius. The final outgoing signal registered at 1:19 a.m., likely when his phone battery died or lost coverage entirely. The 911 log itself is short. Male caller, states in field, out of gas, being chased, the dispatcher wrote. No clear location provided. A second note, added hours later, reads, possible connection to vehicle highway 277. Subject not located. There was no cross-reference with the truck's license plate that night. That step came only after Ledessa called in the next morning. By then, the first hours when heat signatures, scent trails, and cell tracking might still have been viable were gone. Deputies processed the truck again on August 9 once it was towed to a local impound lot. They dusted for prints, finding only those belonging to Brandon and his brother. They photographed the interior and removed a small amount of dust from the dashboard for lab testing. Nothing unusual emerged. A field kit used to detect bodily fluids returned negative. The sheriff later said, "We had no evidence of foul play, no DNA, no indication of another person." Then came the evidence that never was the absences that defined the ledger as much as the findings. Brandon's cell phone was never recovered. His keys, presumed to have been in his hand or pocket, were missing. His hat and shoes were unaccounted for until 2022, when remnants of clothing were found near the recovered remains. The initial search never turned up a single personal object. Even the area where his body was eventually discovered had been marked as cleared. The geography of that area reveals why. The field beyond the fence dips slightly, forming a natural depression invisible from the road. Grass grows shoulder-high in summer, thick with mesquite and thorn. During early searches, volunteers walked parallel to the highway, focusing on open spaces. Few entered the low patch of brush because it appeared to have already been searched by the deputy that first night, a miscommunication later confirmed in reports. When his remains were found nearly 9 years later, investigators recovered fragments of clothing consistent with what he wore: khaki shorts, a black shirt, and shoes. No cell phone, no wallet, no metal keys were located nearby. Weather and wildlife likely scattered or degraded much of what was once there. Forensic testing confirmed DNA from bone samples matched his family, but cause of death was undetermined due to advanced decomposition. Other parts of the ledger come from human observation. The deputy's flashlight sweep, Kyle's recollection of calls, and reports from passing motorists all become informal entries. Each adds a coordinate of uncertainty. The truck's clock displayed 12:47 a.m. when first checked, meaning it had stopped within minutes of the 911 call. Carl's phone records align with that time frame exactly. When he arrived, he described finding his brother's truck facing the wrong direction, nose slightly west, though Brandon had been driving north. That orientation puzzled investigators. It implied he might have turned around just before running out of gas. Fuel residue in the tank confirmed it was nearly empty, holding less than half a gallon. The gas Kyle brought later that night was never added. The deputy had left before he returned. The tow truck driver's notes show the vehicle started immediately once refueled, meaning mechanical failure wasn't to blame. Why then did Brandon's truck stop precisely where it did, on a flat stretch of open highway, rather than the shoulder a few yards ahead? That question remains marked in the ledger's margin, without answer. Digital data filled the remaining pages. Phone towers placed his calls in sequence, Jeep's logs tracked his brother's approach, and dispatch timestamps provided a narrow window of minutes. Together, they draw a map: a truck stopping, a man fleeing into darkness, signals flickering, then silence. Nothing in those records shows another phone or person nearby. Only one device, the 911 call, registered movement, shifting slightly north before cutting off. Years later, analysts reviewing the file observed how minimal the evidence truly was. One investigator wrote, "If you remove speculation, the physical record fits on one page." Another said, "The case isn't mysterious because of what we found, it's mysterious because of what we didn't." That emptiness has become the defining feature of the ledger. It shows a vehicle, a few footprints, a handful of digital traces, and the final recovery of a body, but no link connecting one point to another. Between each line sits time lost to assumption, error, and the immensity of the Texas night. Today, the truck rests in storage, long since returned to the family. The sheriff's office keeps the evidence file sealed, citing privacy. Within it are photographs of the road, the tire marks, and a short inventory sheet listing only 5 items. It is an archive of absence, a reminder that sometimes an investigation ends not with revelation, but with quiet documentation of what will never be known. The night the radios stayed silent. In the earliest hours of the 9th of August 2013, law enforcement across Coke County operated under a patchwork of overlapping jurisdictions. The county itself, vast and sparsely populated, relied on a single dispatcher for several precincts after midnight. That night, the network of communication meant to connect deputies, highway patrol, and emergency operators failed in small but crucial ways. Each gap in radio contact, each missed relay, shaped the disappearance of Brandon Lawson. At 12:50 a.m., a call came through the regional 911 center in San Angelo. The dispatcher heard a male voice saying he was in a field, out of gas, and being chased. The call registered on the Coke County channel, but the precise location was unclear. In theory, this should have triggered an immediate coordination with the nearest patrol unit. Instead, because of radio overlap between Coke County and neighboring Runnels County, the alert was delayed. The dispatcher logged the message and began cross-referencing active calls while waiting for tower triangulation data. Meanwhile, 15 miles away, Deputy Neil Calvert was responding to a different report: an abandoned vehicle partially blocking the southbound lane of Highway 277. That report had come not from dispatch, but from a passing truck driver using a CB radio relay. Calvert was never informed of the earlier 911 call, describing someone in distress near the same area. As he later said in an interview, "We didn't know they were connected until the next morning." The radio systems used in 2013 still depended on analog frequencies with limited range. Between the Colorado River Bridge and the nearest repeater tower, terrain interference often created shadow zones where calls broke up. Deputies patrolling those stretches routinely used mobile phones when the radios failed. That night, service was weak. When Calvert arrived near the bridge at 1:10 a.m., his attempt to radio dispatch produced only static. He logged the stop manually, checked the vehicle, and relayed the license plate number once he regained signal several miles north. By then, dispatch had already flagged the 911 call as unresolved. No one linked the two entries. The lack of coordination extended into the early morning. When Kyle Lawson called to report that his brother was missing, the operator who took his call worked a different shift than the dispatcher who handled the distress call. It wasn't until daylight, when both notes were reviewed side by side, that anyone realized the two men were the same person. Even then, the radio report that circulated among deputies simply read, "Missing adult male, possibly on foot, last seen near Highway 277 bridge." The phrasing suggested a voluntary disappearance, not a rescue operation. Records later showed that 4 separate agencies, Coke County Sheriff's Office, Texas Department of Public Safety, Highway Patrol, and volunteer fire units, monitored different channels that night. None shared a unified frequency. When dispatch attempted to patch them through, overlapping transmissions drowned each other out. What might have been a quick triangulation became a slow relay of partial messages. By 3 a.m., the confusion deepened. Kyle returned to the highway with gasoline, but found the deputy gone. He phoned 911 again, requesting assistance. The operator on duty logged it as vehicle assist and radioed the sheriff's office. The deputy, now on another call north of Bronte, replied that the truck had already been cleared. No one mentioned that the driver remained missing. Internal logs from that night show at least 6 radio transmissions marked inaudible. One, time-stamped 2:14 a.m., records a faint message from Calvert. Truck on 270, 7 clear negative contact with subject. Another, at 2:46 a.m., lists possible family member on scene. The dispatcher's note beside it reads only static. No confirmation followed. These gaps would later be scrutinized in an internal review, but the conclusion was brief. Rural interference equipment functioning as designed. When the morning shift began, around 6 a.m., a new dispatcher compiled overnight logs. Only then did the 911 distress call resurface, matched by timestamp to the abandoned truck. She forwarded the file to the on-duty sergeant, who initiated a search by 8 a.m. By then, 9 hours had passed since Brandon's final call for help. The after-action report, written weeks later, paints a quiet picture of procedural failure rather than negligence. It notes that the 911 system lacked automatic cross-linking between cell data and license plate databases. Each entry required manual comparison. It also highlights that Coke County had only one field deputy on patrol that night, covering an area of more than 900 square miles. Even with perfect communication, response time would have been slow. The sheriff later defended his team, saying, "We did what we could with what we had." Yet the case showed how what they had was often not enough. In 2013, rural departments still rotated analog radios, handwritten logs, and limited Jeeps coverage. The infrastructure assumed most emergencies involved vehicles, not people vanishing into the dark. Kyle Lawson's testimony before investigators describes another moment of silence. At 12:56 a.m., he answered a brief call from Brandon. His brother sounded terrified. The words "I'm bleeding" echoed before the signal cut off. Kyle tried to call back, but reception failed. He later told deputies that the line stayed open for several seconds, filled with static, then went dead. No attempt was made to triangulate his position from that call. The technology existed, but wasn't standard for county-level searches. By midday August 9, the fragmented communication network produced a series of overlapping but incomplete narratives. One report listed "vehicle left unattended." Another said "male subject fled scene." A third recorded "possible injury, unknown cause." None were consolidated until weeks later. In that time, public attention faded and the case shifted from urgent to routine. Years afterward, a state audit of emergency response systems cited the Lawson case as an example of how analog dispatch systems could lose context. A section titled "Time Delay Complications" describes how unlinked databases prevented immediate recognition of connected incidents. The auditors noted, had the vehicle and distress call been correlated within the first 30 minutes, search priority would have been significantly elevated. Today, newer radio systems cover that region with digital repeaters, ensuring clearer transmission. But in 2013, those upgrades were years away. The silence between radio towers, the static on the line, and the assumption that a stalled truck was harmless combined to erase a window of rescue that will never reopen. On paper, the night appears routine: dispatch entries, radio timestamps, and short codes for every transmission. But between those lines lies what cannot be heard, the moments when Brandon Lawson's voice was still reaching out through interference, carried on a system that did not yet know how to listen. The 911 Operator's Dilemma. Inside the Coke County Dispatch Center, the 9th of August 2013 began like any other night shift. Two operators monitored overlapping channels, one handling emergency calls, the other maintaining law enforcement radio traffic. The control room was quiet, its fluorescent lights steady over metal desks and switchboards that had not been updated in years. At 12:50 a.m., the silence broke. The line crackled, then a man's voice came through, faint, breathless, and nearly drowned in static. "Yeah, I'm in the middle of the field. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. The guy is chasing me into the woods." The dispatcher, a woman named Laura, who'd worked there 8 years, leaned closer to her headset. She asked the caller to repeat. The reply was garbled wind, noise, fragments of words. She marked the call, unintelligible male caller, possible distress. What she didn't know was that the man was Brandon Lawson, and that this short recording would one day define the limits of every decision she made afterward. At the time, the 911 system serving Coke County operated on analog lines that automatically routed through a regional hub in San Angelo. This meant dispatchers often fielded calls from areas many miles outside their jurisdiction. When Laura received Brandon's call, the system identified the tower as Bronte North, but it could not specify which side of the highway or how far from town he was. The software required manual entry to trace coordinates, a process that could take several minutes. Meanwhile, procedure dictated that calls labeled unintelligible should still prompt a welfare check, but only if a clear location could be confirmed. Without one, the dispatcher's role was to log the call and move to the next. Brandon's call lasted just 43 seconds, too short for a full trace, too unclear for an alert code. She marked the log, time-stamped 050, and forwarded it to the sheriff's desk for morning review. What happened next reveals how a single classification, unintelligible, can change everything. The sheriff's deputy on duty that night never received the call. Instead, minutes later, another report arrived from a passing motorist describing an abandoned truck partially blocking Highway 277. The two reports, one about a man in distress, the other about an empty vehicle, were filed separately under different reference numbers. No one realized they described the same scene. Later transcripts show that Laura replayed the audio twice after the line disconnected. In her written statement, she said, "The caller sounded scared. I tried to call back, but the number wouldn't reconnect." She logged it as attempted callback, no answer. To outside investigators, that single phrase reflected a critical lost opportunity. Under newer protocols, dispatchers would attempt triangulation immediately and issue a county-wide alert. But in 2013, those procedures weren't yet standard for small departments. The second operator on duty, handling radio traffic, later said he overheard fragments of Laura's call. He said something about a car and a field, he recalled. "But we get those all the time, people stuck, lost, drunk, you name it." He added that the tone of the call didn't immediately suggest violence. It was fast, broken up, could have been interference. Within half an hour, the night quieted again. The distress call slipped into the queue behind routine dispatch notes, wildlife sightings, weather updates, and a request for a tow truck. When the deputy radioed in about the stranded F-150, the dispatcher entered it as a separate log. Neither mentioned a possible missing person. By the time morning staff arrived, the system displayed two unrelated incidents: one incomplete emergency call from a male subject in a field, and one abandoned truck near Bronte. The connection between them would not be noticed until several hours later, when Brandon's partner, Ladessa Lofton, phoned the same dispatch office to report that her boyfriend hadn't returned home. The moment she gave his name, the operator recognized it from the earlier 911 log. At 8:30 a.m., the dispatcher's supervisor retrieved the call recording. She replayed it multiple times with the volume raised. "It sounded like he was running," she said later, in a training review. "But I couldn't tell from what." She immediately notified the sheriff's office and instructed deputies to begin a search. But by then, more than 7 hours had passed since the first call. Internal memos later obtained by journalists show how close the call came to being deleted. Dispatch centers routinely purge audio marked unintelligible after 90 days, unless linked to an active case. Had Ledessa not called that morning, Brandon's 911 recording might have been lost. The memo reads, "Audio preserved due to subsequent missing person classification." In the following weeks, the operators who handled the call faced quiet scrutiny. The sheriff defended them publicly, saying they followed protocol with the information available. Privately, several dispatchers questioned whether the classification system itself was to blame. One wrote in a training note, "We label something as unintelligible when it may just be unverified. Those are not the same thing." The 911 center later implemented small changes, new drop-down categories like distress unclear location and caller disconnected during emergency report. But these adjustments came long after Brandon was gone. For the operators who heard the call, it never left them. Some said they replayed it years later, long after they learned of the discovery of his remains. "You keep thinking if you'd pushed harder," one said. "Maybe the deputy would have gone back sooner." Others described the helplessness of listening to someone plead for help and realizing the line was dying, not from neglect, but from the simple failure of signal and time. Every call taken that night still exists in digital archive. Brandon's, the truck driver's, the tow request. Each file bears the same flat notation date, time, duration, caller unknown. Yet among them, one stands apart, a faint voice buried in static, a record of urgency lost between systems. In law enforcement training now, the Lawson call is played as an example of how ambiguity can alter a response. Trainees are asked to decide whether they would have classified it differently. Most hesitate. Even with the benefit of hindsight, no one agrees on what exactly they hear. The only certainty is that a man called for help and a voice answered, but not soon enough. The silence of the field. At first glance, the land where Brandon Lawson vanished looks unremarkable, flat, open, the kind of Texas terrain where nothing seems able to hide. Yet for searchers, that stretch of ground between Bronte and Tennyson proved deceptive. It is a landscape that plays tricks on sight and sound, where distance and direction dissolve under the hum of heat and the murmur of insects. To understand how a man could vanish there, one must first understand the silence of that field. Highway 277 cuts through the center of Coke County, running north from San Angelo like a thin gray scar. The Colorado River crosses beneath a narrow bridge just before the road begins to rise again into dry upland pasture. The spot where Brandon's truck was found just past the bridge is bordered by barbed wire fences on both sides, enclosing wide ranch lands that stretch for miles. The nearest home sits nearly half a mile away. Cell service fades in and out, depending on which way the wind moves. At night, the land becomes almost soundless. Crickets, coyotes, and the soft rush of the river replace the day's distant engine noise. When the search teams first gathered there on the 9th of August 2013, they noticed how voices didn't travel far. A shout disappeared into the dark before it reached the next line of volunteers. Flashlights caught only brief walls of grass, each step revealing or concealing patches of uneven soil. The field itself seemed to swallow sound and light alike. The vegetation grows in thick clusters of mesquite, cactus, and knee-high weeds. The soil, hard and dry on top, breaks into powder below, creating hollows where a person could easily sink and vanish from view. When Brandon's brother Kyle first searched near the truck that night, his flashlight beam barely penetrated the first few yards beyond the fence. He later told investigators, "You could walk 10 feet off the road and not see the headlights anymore." That invisibility explains much of what followed. The initial assumption that Brandon had walked up the highway toward Bronte was logical if one imagined open space, but the field between the road and the river dips just enough to hide anyone moving through it. Searchers walking in straight lines later discovered that the depression forms a natural corridor about 60 yards wide, running parallel to the highway. If Brandon entered that trough while trying to avoid oncoming headlights or perceived pursuers, he could have traveled unseen even as his brother and a deputy stood nearby. The silence of that place also changes perception. Locals call it dead air country, a region where radios and phones often fail. Even sound itself feels muted. Investigators who returned years later to reconstruct the scene noted that shouting from the bridge was barely audible 50 yards away, muffled by grass and wind. One described it as a quiet that eats sound. In the daylight, the field reveals another difficulty: sameness. Every patch of grass looks like the next, every fence post identical. Without a reference point, orientation slips easily. A person running from a perceived threat might turn in circles without realizing it. Searchers found that even experienced trackers struggled to maintain direction once inside the brush. GPS devices often failed to load, leaving teams to navigate by the Sunday. During the first days of searching, deputies marked their paths with orange tape and wooden stakes, each representing a cleared zone. When viewed from above by helicopter, those lines formed a patchwork across the landscape-wide spaces between them, left untouched. It was in one of those gaps that Brandon's remains would eventually be found. The river adds to the confusion. Though called the Colorado, here it is narrow and shallow, running quietly under the bridge and looping behind the field in a slow arc. At night it is invisible, its sound indistinguishable from wind through grass. Early searchers assumed Brandon had avoided the water entirely. Later analysis suggested he may have crossed it or collapsed near its edge. The current could have carried smaller objects, clothing, a phone downstream before dawn, erasing clues within hours. Even the local wildlife contributed to the silence. Rattlesnakes, wild hogs and coyotes moved cautiously there, avoiding noise. Volunteers reported finding fresh tracks but hearing almost nothing. The absence of birdsong, one said, was what made it eerie. You realize the only sound is yourself breathing. As weeks passed, the field remained unchanged. Rain washed away footprints. Grass grew back. In photographs taken months later, the scene looks untouched. A ribbon of highway, a gate, an endless dry brush. Yet beneath that stillness lay everything that was missed. Footprints fading by dawn, a faint trail through weeds, perhaps even Brandon himself lying just beyond view. For locals, the site became known as the Lawson Field. Travelers still slow as they pass, though there is no marker. The fence line remains bent where searchers climbed over. Beyond it, only emptiness, no memorial, no sign of struggle, just land returning to itself. Years later, when remains were recovered roughly 100 yards from where the truck had been, investigators remarked how the landscape itself had hidden him. He was close enough that the road's noise would have been audible, yet far enough for the world to move on without noticing. The silence that once swallowed his voice had also preserved his absence. The field teaches a quiet lesson about disappearance. It does not take dense forest or mountains to conceal a person, only the right mix of darkness, distance, and still air. In that silence, shouts fade, signals die, and minutes stretch into years. The searchers eventually left, the highway reopened, and the grass grew high again. Nothing about the land suggests tragedy, yet for those who know its story, every gust of wind feels like an echo of a voice that once said, "Please hurry." The man behind the voice. Before his name became attached to a mystery, Brandon Lawson was known mostly for his work ethic. Born in 1986, he grew up in Crowley, Texas, a small community outside Fort Worth, where long days and short paychecks were common. He left school early, took construction jobs, and eventually found steady work in the oil fields near San Angelo. The work was rough 12-hour shifts under a hard sun but dependable. By his mid-20s, Brandon was supporting his longtime partner, Ladessa Lofton, and their 4 children. Those who knew him described him as quiet, stubborn, but reliable. He didn't talk much about fear, only about fixing what needed fixing. Friends said he was happiest behind the wheel of his truck, driving long stretches between drilling sites. To them, his disappearance in 2013 didn't fit the man they knew. He wasn't the type to vanish. He was the one who showed up. In the weeks before that night, life had been stressful. The oilfield schedule left him exhausted, and disagreements at home had built up. Ladessa later told reporters that the two had argued that evening over his long hours and the pressure of raising children mostly alone while he worked nights. After the argument, he packed a few things and said he was heading to his father's house in Fort Worth, about 3 hours away. He didn't take much with him, only what he could grab in the moment. Brandon's brother, Kyle, was used to those late-night calls between work shifts. The two were close, sharing family ties and similar jobs. When Brandon called around midnight saying he'd run out of gas near Bronte, Kyle didn't hesitate to help. He'd done it before. Nothing about the call felt unusual, until Brandon's tone changed, words coming faster, background noise louder, a trace of fear. Within minutes, his brother's calm voice was gone, replaced by panic. Those who later examined the case often debated Brandon's state of mind that night. Some pointed to stress, and exhaustion, others to possible drug use. A warrant for his arrest over a past charge weighed on him, though minor. Family members said it caused tension, but not fear. To them, his 911 call didn't sound like a man avoiding police. It sounded like a man running from something else. His father, Brad, described him as hard-working, but impulsive. He'd help anyone, anytime, he told a local station. He just got overwhelmed sometimes. Brandon's job at the time involved maintaining pump jacks near Garden City, often leaving before dawn and returning late. The shifts were long, the paychecks steady, but never enough. In that world, fatigue was constant. When combined with the pressure of family life, it could make anyone restless. The night he disappeared, that restlessness may have turned into motion. The decision to drive tired after an argument with little gas wasn't planned. Investigators believe he intended to clear his head, reach his father's home, and talk things through. The route he chose, north along Highway 277, was the fastest but also the emptiest. Miles without houses, without lights. In his final hours, Brandon left traces of ordinary life, calls to family, messages of reassurance, promises to come home soon. Ledessa received a voicemail minutes before the 911 call. He said he was okay, that he just needed gas. His voice was steady. Then, something shifted. When people imagine him now, they picture the frantic man on the recording, not the one who worked steady shifts or fixed engines in the driveway. But to his family, that was who he truly was. A father who read bedtime stories between shifts. A partner who called every night from work. A man who loved the simple things. Barbecue on weekends, fishing trips, a new set of tools. Friends described him as loyal to a fault. If you called, he came, one co-worker said. Didn't matter the time. That loyalty defines the tragedy, because on the night he needed help, the systems around him failed to answer. After his disappearance, Ledessa stayed in San Angelo, raising their children while managing calls from reporters, deputies, and strangers online. She maintained that Brandon wasn't suicidal or violent. He just wanted to come home, she said. Kyle carried guilt for years, convinced he'd been too late with the fuel. Their father rarely spoke publicly, but when he did, his words were simple. He got lost, and the world forgot to look long enough. Looking back, those who revisited the case tried to reconstruct his state of mind from fragments phone logs, messages, and the way his voice cracked between sentences. Stress, exhaustion, and fear can create confusion, but they cannot alone explain why he ran into darkness rather than toward light. To understand the man behind the voice is to see both, the worker who built his life with calloused hands and the frightened figure calling from a field. Between them lies everything that went wrong that night: miscommunication, silence, and a single decision that changed the course of a family's life. Years later, when his remains were confirmed, his children were old enough to ask questions. Ledessa said she told them their father got lost, but not forgotten. It is a phrase that captures him best: steady, flawed, human. The voice on the tape was not just panic, it was persistence, the last effort of a man trying to be found. Now, the story of Brandon Lawson is often told as a mystery, a case study in rural disappearance. But to those who knew him, it's simpler. It's about a man who worked until exhaustion, loved deeply, and called for help in a place where no one could hear. The brothers' search. For years after Brandon Lawson disappeared, his brother Kyle lived with a sentence that never seemed to end. I was there, he told interviewers later, and I still couldn't find him. The hours he spent on Highway 277 that night became the core of the mystery, the only first-hand account of what unfolded after the 911 call. When Brandon first phoned him around 12:30 a.m. on the 9th of August 2013, Kyle was at home in San Angelo, half asleep. Brandon said he'd run out of gas near Bronte and needed help. Kyle grabbed a gas can, told his wife Audrey he'd be back soon, and left in his pickup. The drive north took about 45 minutes. Along the way, the phone rang again. Brandon's tone had changed. His words came in fragments, something about being in a field and someone chasing him. Kyle thought it sounded strange, but assumed exhaustion or confusion. He kept driving. At 1:10 a.m., Kyle reached the area near the Colorado River Bridge and spotted Brandon's white F-150 on the shoulder, its hazard lights off. The truck sat slightly angled into the lane, driver's door unlocked. He called out his brother's name, but heard only wind and the faint hum of passing trucks. When a sheriff's deputy pulled up minutes later, Kyle explained that Brandon had called for gas. Neither of them yet knew about the 911 distress call made only 20 minutes earlier. The deputy shone his flashlight around the truck's interior. Wallet, charger, and keys still there. No phone, no driver. He told Kyle the truck would need towing if it remained unattended. Kyle offered to fetch fuel from his house while the deputy waited. That decision created the fatal gap in the search. By the time Kyle returned with gasoline around 3 a.m., the deputy was gone. The truck sat alone. He poured fuel into the tank, expecting his brother to step out from the dark. Nothing moved. Then the phone rang. Brandon's voice came through, faint and uneven. "I'm bleeding," he said. The line cut. Kyle tried to call back, but the signal dropped. He began walking along the fence line, calling into the night. At one point he thought he heard a distant "yeah," a single word carried by wind. He moved toward it, but the sound faded. The terrain beyond the fence was dense, the ground uneven, filled with holes and thorny brush. His flashlight barely reached beyond a few feet. He later told investigators, "You could get turned around in there in seconds." After an hour of searching, he drove to a nearby gas station to see if Brandon had tried calling from there. No one had seen him. He returned to the bridge area just before dawn and flagged down another deputy. Together they walked the roadside, scanning ditches and culverts. Again, nothing. The assumption remained that Brandon had wandered off and would turn up by morning. That assumption haunted Kyle for years. When daylight came and the truck was towed, he realized no official search had been launched. He called the sheriff's office repeatedly, pressing them to treat it as an emergency. By midday, dispatch confirmed that the mysterious 911 call from earlier matched Brandon's phone number. Only then did the search begin in earnest. In the days that followed, Kyle became both family liaison and volunteer leader. He organized search teams, contacted ranch owners for access, and distributed flyers. His voice appeared on early news reports, always steady, always insisting his brother would be found. But behind that calm was guilt. "If I'd stayed," he said later, "maybe I would have heard him." For years afterward, Kyle revisited that night in interviews, retracing the same steps: the approach, the flashlight beam, the empty truck, the missed connection. Online investigators often questioned him, some suggesting he knew more than he admitted. He faced those suspicions quietly, answering every question, releasing his phone records, even passing a polygraph. None of it changed the narrative. He was the last person to hear his brother's voice. His relationship with law enforcement remained strained. He believed deputies dismissed the urgency that night, assuming drugs or avoidance rather than distress. In statements, he admitted Brandon had struggled with substance use, but insisted it didn't explain the panic in his voice. Something scared him, he told reporters. That's not how he sounded when he was just high or tired. That was fear. For nearly 9 years, Kyle continued searching. He returned to the site repeatedly on birthdays, anniversaries, any day he could take off work. He knew the land better than anyone, where the fence dipped, where the grass thinned, where a man could collapse unseen. When volunteer teams joined years later with drones and cadaver dogs, he guided them to those same places. Each time, the result was the same nothing. Then, in February 2022, a team of private searchers called him with news. They had found human remains near the same fence line he had crossed countless times. He drove to the site and stood silently as investigators worked. The location was painfully close, barely 100 yards from where his brother's truck had been. He was right there, Kyle said quietly. All this time right there. For Kyle, the discovery brought both relief and sorrow. It ended the search, but not the questions. Why had the early search teams missed that area? Why hadn't anyone connected the 911 call to the truck sooner? And what had Brandon meant when he said he was bleeding? In interviews after the case was closed, Kyle spoke less about answers and more about timing. Minutes matter, he said. He called me. He called 911. The system just didn't meet him halfway. The public remembers Brandon's voice, but for the family, Kyle's search defines the story: the long nights, the phone calls, the years spent driving that same highway, hoping to undo a single night's miscommunication. Each visit to the bridge ends the same way. Kyle parking, stepping out, and standing in silence, as if listening for the call that still echoes faintly through the wind. The town that remembered. By sunrise on the 9th of August 2013, word had already travelled through Bronte, a ranching town of barely 1,000 people. The sight of flashing lights along Highway 277 wasn't unusual. Vehicles stalled there often, but the talk spread quickly. A young man's truck had been found on the bridge, and no one knew where he'd gone. At the Al Soup's gas station, truckers compared guesses. One said he'd passed the same pickup hours earlier. Another swore he saw someone walking north along the fence line. The clerk behind the counter told deputies that a woman had stopped in around 1 a.m. asking if anyone had seen a man on foot, but she couldn't recall details. Rumour, not evidence, shaped those first hours. By noon, volunteers from Bronte, Tennyson, and Robert Lee had joined the search. Farmers lent ATVs, the local fire department provided radios, ranchers opened their gates. They knew the land better than anyone, the low gullies, the dips where cattle gathered at night. Yet even with that knowledge, the field swallowed them. One firefighter later said, "You could stand 50 feet from a man and never know it." For several days, the town worked in shifts. Mornings began with prayer circles outside the volunteer station, ending with silence as teams headed out. People who'd never met the Lawson family still called it our search. Teenagers taped flyers to diner windows. Church bulletins listed donation drives for fuel and supplies. A nearby wrecker company offered trucks to haul search equipment. But as days passed, unease crept in. The heat climbed past 100 degrees, and the story changed with each retelling. Some said he'd been hiding from police. Others whispered about drugs or an ambush. None of it could be proven, but gossip filled the space that facts could not. The sheriff tried to quiet speculation, saying only, "We're following leads." For locals, that sounded like saying nothing at all. At the hardware store, people debated the 911 call. One man claimed to have heard it on the news and insisted another voice was speaking over Brandon's. A teacher countered that the wind alone explained the noise. For a while, the tape became part of small-town folklore. A sound passed through phones, discussed in parking lots, analysed over coffee. "You can hear the fear," someone would say, and another would nod, uncertain what fear should sound like. After the first week, searches thinned. School was starting, fields needed tending, and the story faded from the front pages of the San Angelo Standard Times. Still, the case lingered. Deputies kept a map on the wall marked with bright pins, showing each area searched. Visitors passing through town often asked about the boy who vanished. Locals pointed to the bridge and said, "Right there." Quote, months later, hunters sometimes reported odd findings: torn clothing, old boots, but none matched. The sheriff's office investigated every call. Each time, nothing. The town learned to live with absence, the way rural places do with endurance rather than closure. Years passed. Children who'd heard the story at school grew up seeing that bridge as a boundary between ordinary and unexplained. New residents learned the details from neighbours. The 911 call, the truck, the field, the family, still waiting. By then, the search had become a kind of ritual memory. In 2019, a podcast on unsolved cases featured the story, drawing outsiders to Bronte. Journalists stopped by the diner, photographers took pictures of the highway, and drone operators hovered over pastures. Locals watched politely but kept distance. "They come for the mystery," one rancher said, "but they don't stay for the silence." When the remains were discovered in 2022, the town reacted quietly. There were no memorials or processions, only a collective exhale that ended 9 years of wandering. Some said it brought peace, others said it changed nothing. The bridge looked the same, the fences the same, the field still empty. Yet in conversation, people began using the past tense. "That's where he was lost," they'd say. Today, the Lawson case remains a story the region tells itself about distance and response time, about how small errors grow in wide spaces. In Bronte, the truck stop cashier still remembers the deputy's flashlight crossing the bridge that night. The fire captain keeps a worn map of the search grid in his desk. Each pin marks not just a place searched, but a memory held. Rural towns are built on such recollections, shared tragedies that bind strangers into witnesses. The disappearance of Brandon Lawson became one of those bonds. Even now, when storms pass through and lightning silhouettes the fence line, some swear they see a flicker of white among the weeds. They know it's imagination, yet the story endures because it belongs to the land as much as to the family who waited. Every generation retells it slightly differently. The truck without gas, the call in the dark, the man who ran into the field. What never changes is the pause afterward, the space where people lower their voices and glance toward the highway, remembering how silence, once again, outlasted the search. The investigator's notes. The official record of Brandon Lawson's disappearance fills less than a single binder. Within it are interview transcripts, dispatch logs, and handwritten notes in the margins, small remarks by deputies and state investigators, trying to make sense of something that never quite fit the template of a missing person case. For nearly 9 years, these notes guided every search and every theory, even when the conclusions refused to take shape. The first report was filed by Deputy Neil Calvert at 2:30 a.m. on the 9th of August 2013. It described vehicle abandoned on Highway 277 near Colorado River Bridge, no driver on scene. Under condition of vehicle, he wrote, no damage, unlocked, wallet and keys inside, out of gas. In a side note added later, he circled the word keys and wrote, may have been wrong owner's brother, claims driver had keys. It was the first of many small contradictions that would ripple through the file. The second set of entries came from dispatch. The operator's typed log of the 911 call included only a few lines. Male caller reports in field, out of gas, being chased. Location unclear. Caller disconnected. The timestamp 0:50 hours was followed by a blank comment field, one that should have contained follow-up data or call trace coordinates. Later, a supervisor added a note in pen, audio forwarded to Sheriff's Office 8:30. That 8-hour gap became the centerpiece of every internal review that followed. When investigators began interviewing family members that afternoon, they found themselves piecing together a timeline built entirely from phone records. The logs showed repeated attempts by Brandon to reach both his brother and partner, but the content of those calls was lost. Only durations remained. The file's narrative summary, typed days later, begins with the phrase, subject left residence after domestic dispute, believed to be travelling to father's residence. From that point forward, every interpretation of the case began with that assumption that he left voluntarily, not as a target of a crime. Over the next week, investigators recorded statements from everyone involved. Kyle Lawson's interview filled 5 pages. He detailed the drive, the search, the phone call where his brother said, I'm bleeding. The interviewer underlined that phrase twice. In the margin, an investigator wrote, ask medic, could dehydration divided by confusion cause perceived bleeding? It was the beginning of the department's working theory disorientation leading to collapse. Other interviews followed. Ladessa Lofton described the argument that evening, emphasizing that Brandon wasn't angry, just tired. She mentioned that he'd been up since dawn and hadn't eaten much. The investigator added, fatigue divided by possible stimulant use. A separate note reads, possible warrant may have influenced flight from officer. None of these explanations were confirmed, but they filled the silence where facts were missing. When the Texas Rangers briefly joined the case in September 2013, they brought forensic mapping tools. Their report is clinical and detached. Area searched by air and ground with negative results. Terrain rough, thick vegetation, high likelihood subject deceased within 24 hours of disappearance. The final line reads simply, no indicators of foul play. Their involvement lasted less than a month before jurisdiction reverted to Coke County. Inside the main folder, the handwriting shifts from careful to hurried as the years pass. A 2014 note mentions cadaver dogs alerting weekly near fence line. Another, dated 2016, records a citizen tip about possible sighting north of Tennyson, later dismissed as unfounded. Many of the later pages are emails printed on office paper, correspondence between search volunteers, law enforcement, and family representatives. Each message repeats a version of the same question, where do we go next? In 2018, a new sheriff reviewed the case and ordered all files digitized. The internal memo from that audit, preserved in the binder, is telling, records incomplete, original audio intact, no chain of custody issues, case considered inactive pending discovery of remains. It was a bureaucratic acknowledgement of stalemate, nothing more. When human remains were found in 2022, the file was reopened briefly. The evidence inventory expanded to include photographs, Jeep's coordinates, and DNA confirmation documents. Yet, the accompanying summary, written in plain language, offers no conclusion. Remains identified as Brandon Lawson. No trauma identified. Death consistent with exposure or dehydration. The Texas Rangers added a final note in blue ink. No criminal indicators. Case closed. But in the pages beneath that summary are older comments, small, almost personal reflections by investigators who'd walked that ground themselves. One deputy wrote, still strange how close he was to the road. Another, could he have been hiding from lights, thought we were the ones chasing him. A third note, barely legible, reads simply, Too many maybes. These handwritten remarks reveal something that never entered public reports: quiet uncertainty. The official stance ruled out foul play, yet individual officers remained unconvinced. In interviews years later, some admitted that the case lingered in their minds long after it left the docket. "You want answers," one said, "but the field doesn't give them, it just takes them." The binder now rests in an archive cabinet at the Coke County Sheriff's Office, labeled Lawson, Brandon closed. Its pages record not resolution, but accumulation of data, of effort, of unanswered questions. Each line marks a step toward clarity that never arrived. The investigator's notes form less a conclusion than a record of how long people can keep searching for meaning in silence. No single page explains what happened. Instead, the file stands as a quiet chronicle of process, of people doing their jobs carefully, repeatedly, within systems that could not bridge one man's last words to the ground where he fell. For the investigators, it ended on paper. For the town, the family, and anyone who ever listened to the tape, it did not end at all. The call that haunted them. For those who worked the case, the 43 seconds of Brandon Lawson's 911 call never left them. Even after the file was closed, the recording lived on in training rooms, podcasts, and private recollection, an echo that refused to fade. Everyone who had heard it described the same sensation, not just fear, but distance, as if the voice were calling from somewhere between this world and another. When the call was first logged in August 2013, it was treated as routine, a garbled report from a lost motorist. But once Brandon's disappearance turned public, the audio became the center of every conversation. Deputies replayed it during staff briefings, dispatchers used it to train new hires, journalists clipped it into documentaries. Each time, the same questions resurfaced. What did he mean by "one car here"? Was he saying, "They're chasing me," or "they shot the guys"? Why did the wind sound like waves? Within months, the recording had been duplicated, compressed, and uploaded dozens of times. Every copy added slight distortion, deepening the mystery. To law enforcement, it was evidence. To the public, it was a riddle. Analysts tried noise reduction, spectral filtering, and linguistic mapping. None produced agreement. A state audio technician in 2014 wrote, "Caller appears coherent, under stress, cannot confirm additional voices." Another listener swore he heard breathing beside Brandon's. Inside the Coke County Sheriff's Office, the recording earned a quiet nickname, the ghost tape. Deputies played it after shifts, arguing over single syllables. One insisted the phrase was, "We ran into them." Another, "We're out here going toward Abilene." Each interpretation created a new theory. The sheriff finally banned casual replays, noting in a memo, "Audio is open to subjective hearing, no further conclusions to be drawn." But still, people listened. Years later, retired dispatcher Laura admitted she kept a copy on a flash drive at home. "It's not about proof," she said. "It's about voice. You never forget a voice asking for help." She played it once more during an interview, headphones on, eyes closed, then said nothing for a long moment after it ended. The audio's influence reached far beyond Coke County. Online communities slowed it down, added captions, debated the words frame by frame. Some called it evidence of foul play. Others saw it as a tragic misunderstanding of sound and fear. Yet for those directly involved, the meaning was simpler. The tape marked the last time anyone heard Brandon alive. Investigators who joined the case later approached it differently. One ranger played the file in an empty field near the bridge, listening through a portable speaker to see if ambient conditions could reproduce the distortion. He noted how wind rushing through mesquite created almost identical interference. His report concluded, environmental acoustics may account for perceived multiple voices. Still, he admitted the recording carried an unsettling cadence, pauses too deliberate, breaths too loud. When the remains were found in 2022, some hoped the call would finally make sense, but even with the physical evidence, its content stayed unresolved. The final report attached the same short description: male caller reports being chased, location unknown. No revision, no clarity. The audio remained frozen in its original ambiguity. In private, officers admitted that the recording followed them. One deputy said he dreamed of it looping endlessly, the words blending into static. Another said that every time a new 911 call came in at night, he listened for that same tone, the one between fear and disbelief. For dispatchers, it became a symbol of how small a margin separates help received from help lost. The file's endurance changed how neighboring counties handled future calls. Policies shifted, Any unintelligible distress call within highway range now triggered immediate patrol dispatch. Radios were upgraded, cell ping triangulation installed, and training courses renamed the case the Lawson Protocol. The improvements were practical, but everyone understood what lay beneath them, an attempt to answer a voice that never got an answer. Today, the recording survives in countless copies, some clear, others clouded by generations of re-uploads. In each, Brandon's tone cuts through the distortion, steady yet desperate. The wind hums behind him, and for an instant you can almost sense the field, the empty road, the dark horizon, the isolation of a signal fading. Those who were there still replay it occasionally. They say it reminds them not of mystery, but of obligation. A single voice on a broken line became the reason new systems were built, new habits formed. The words remain uncertain, but the silence that followed them changed how an entire region listened. For the Lawson family, the call is both memory and evidence, a fragment of their last connection to him. Ledessa once said, "It's not what he said that matters, it's that he called." In the end, that may be all the tape reveals. A man alone, trying to reach anyone, somewhere between signal and static, speaking into the dark until the line went quiet. The field revisited. 9 years after the night Brandon Lawson vanished, the same stretch of land looked unchanged. The bridge still carried the slow traffic of Highway 277. The same barbed wire fences lined the roadside, and the field beyond remained an expanse of tangled mesquite and sun-dried grass. Yet in February 2022, a private search team, led by volunteers from Texas Search and Rescue Recovery, returned there with new equipment, drones, mapping software, and quiet determination. They came not expecting answers, only hoping to end the silence that had lasted nearly a decade. The effort began on a cool morning, under a pale sky. The group parked near the same shoulder where Brandon's truck had been found. They marked coordinates and fanned out slowly, walking the perimeter of a property owned by a local rancher who had recently granted renewed access. Within minutes, one of the handlers noticed bones scattered beneath a low canopy of brush. The discovery seemed at first like animal remains, small, sun-bleached, fragmented by weather. But as the team moved closer, the pattern changed. Human. They stopped and radioed the county sheriff. Deputies arrived within an hour, sealing the site with yellow tape and photographing the ground. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture quiet. Some of the volunteers stood back, silent, recognizing the weight of what they'd found. For years they had walked this same soil, scanning for traces. Now, less than 100 yards from where the truck once stood, the case had resurfaced. The forensic team from San Angelo arrived that afternoon. They documented the scene, carefully, skeletal remains dispersed across a 10-foot radius, fragments of clothing caught in roots, a pair of work boots partially intact. In one boot's heel, they found a small fragment of what appeared to be a cell phone battery. The vegetation had grown through and around it, fixing everything in place like a museum display built by time. It was quiet work. The sound of the wind moving through dry grass was louder than their voices. A deputy remarked how easily the body could have lain undetected. From the highway, the area looked flat, but here the ground dipped just enough to hide anything below waist height. A searcher murmured, "He was right here all along," and no one responded. Over the next 2 days, they collected what the earth had preserved. DNA samples were taken, coordinates logged, photographs catalogued. The sheriff contacted the Lawson family before releasing any details publicly. When confirmation came back weeks later from the University of North Texas Forensic Center, it was definitive. The remains were Brandon Lawson's. The official statement was brief. It confirmed identification, but withheld cause of death, pending review. In practice, the physical evidence told little about what had happened. No trauma was visible, no weapon, no clear sign of struggle. The medical examiner's report simply listed undetermined likely exposure. To investigators, that was both answer and void. Still, for those who had searched for years, it was something. The site became a quiet destination. Kyle Lawson visited first, walking alone to the taped perimeter, leaving a folded piece of paper under a rock. He didn't speak to reporters that day. The note's contents were never shared, but one deputy recalled him standing still for nearly half an hour, as if listening to the field itself. In the following weeks, locals came by, farmers, firefighters, even the gas station clerk who remembered that night. They parked along the shoulder, stepped past the guardrail, and stood among the weeds. The land was the same, but their perception of it had shifted. For nearly a decade it had symbolized uncertainty. Now it held a kind of reluctant truth. The sheriff's office released aerial photos of the area to show the proximity between the discovery site and the original truck location. The distance, just under 300 feet, stunned even veteran officers. It reignited questions about how earlier searches had missed it. The explanation, officials said, was vegetation density and uneven terrain. In aerial maps from 2013, the spot was obscured by shadow. Ground teams at the time had followed fence lines and visible trails, missing the depression entirely. To the volunteers, it was a lesson in humility. The field had outlasted technology, manpower, and persistence. It had absorbed every attempt to read it. When the last evidence markers were removed, the grass bent back into place, erasing the only sign of disturbance. In April 2022, the remains were released to the Lawson family. No public memorial was held, only a private service in San Angelo. The obituary listed his birth, death, and the simple line, "He was loved by many and missed by all." For the family, closure was complicated. The discovery brought an end to searching, but not to wondering. Online discussions reignited immediately after the news broke. Some accepted the result as tragic accident. Others insisted on hidden details, foul play, missteps, withheld data. The sheriff's office issued a final press release stating there was no evidence of third-party involvement. After that, the official investigation closed permanently. Yet for those who had been part of the search, the discovery changed little about how they spoke of the case. It wasn't about finding answers, one volunteer said. It was about finding him. They referred to the field almost reverently, aware that it had kept its secret until it chose not to. Today, if you stand on the shoulder of Highway 277 and look east toward the river, the area seems ordinary, open, still, wind moving through grass. A faint tire rut marks where search trucks once parked. The bridge hums with passing cars, none slowing anymore. The place gives no hint of what it held for 9 years, only the quiet presence of something finally returned. And still, some who were there admit the silence feels the same. The wind carries a low, constant tone, the same one heard faintly behind Brandon's 911 call. For them, the sound is not haunting. It is simply what the land does. It keeps voices, distorts them, and eventually gives them back when no one expects it. Theories that refuse to die. Even after Brandon Lawson's remains were identified and the case closed, the speculation never stopped. For 9 years, the story had grown in fragments, audio clips, dispatch logs, grainy satellite images, and when the official explanation finally arrived, it felt too small to hold the weight of what people had imagined. Exposure and disorientation were simple words. They could not contain a man's final words on a broken phone line. In the absence of certainty, theories multiplied. The first and most common held that Brandon was fleeing from the law. A warrant for a 2012 drug possession charge remained active at the time of his disappearance. Some believed that when the deputy arrived at his truck, fear of arrest made him run into the field. The idea fit easily with a surface reading of the case, yet those who knew him said it ignored the tone of the 911 call. People running from police don't usually ask for help. They don't say they're bleeding. They don't sound like men terrified of someone else. Another theory pointed to drug use itself. Family members confirmed that Brandon had used methamphetamine in the days before his disappearance, possibly during a long shift at the oil field. Advocates of this view claimed that paranoia or hallucination might explain his claim of being chased. The wide, empty field could have disoriented him further, leading to exhaustion and collapse. Investigators quietly leaned toward this possibility, noting no evidence of violence or robbery. But others argued that drug use alone could not account for his phone calls, the repeated attempts to reach family, the clear intention to get help. The third theory centered on misidentification. Brandon's statement, "I ran into them," sparked debate. Some believed he had witnessed a crime or encountered strangers on the road. Rumors spread about oilfield trucks operating illegally that night or smuggling routes running through the area. None were proven. Deputies found no tire tracks beyond his own, yet the phrase lingered, suggestive and unresolved. Online investigators added their own possibilities: an accident, a wild animal attack, even a hit and run covered up by locals. Forums dissected every syllable of the 911 call. One user mapped supposed patterns in the static, suggesting other voices overlapped with his. Another matched his final cell ping to a theory about the river current carrying items away. Each thread produced new conclusions, all conflicting, none verifiable. Among people closest to the case, a quieter theory persisted that he had simply panicked. Exhaustion, argument, a long drive, darkness, and erratic cell service combined into confusion. The 911 call, in this view, captured not external danger, but inner unraveling. He may have wandered from the road, fallen, and lost consciousness before dawn. The field's silence finished the rest. This was the version the sheriff's office eventually leaned on, not out of certainty, but because it left the fewest gaps. Yet some details resisted explanation. Why did his phone remain active for hours afterward, sending signals long after the final call? Why did dogs not detect scent trails near the discovery site during early searches? Why was his voice so clear in some parts of the tape, distorted in others? Theories collided against those questions like moths against glass, drawn to the light, unable to break through. For locals, the theories mattered less than what they symbolized. Each explanation reflected something familiar: fear of law enforcement, distrust of institutions, or faith that rural isolation could hide more than it revealed. Every possibility said as much about the listeners as about Brandon himself. By the time the remains were found, the online community surrounding the case had grown into a small ecosystem: podcasts, message boards, YouTube reconstructions. After the discovery, many struggled to reconcile closure with curiosity. The body was found, but the story had no ending. Official statements used words like resolution and confirmation, but listeners kept hearing the same thing: uncertainty preserved. The Texas Rangers' final note, "no evidence of foul play," became both fact and provocation. To some, it meant peace. To others, it sounded like silence mistaken for truth. The sheriff's office received new emails for months afterward, suggesting revisits, alternate angles, and new forensic methods. None changed the conclusion. Still, the mystery lingered because the pieces never fit perfectly. A healthy, alert man disappeared within sight of a major highway. His truck was untouched, his body nearby, his words chaotic yet coherent. Even if exposure killed him, something had driven him into that field in the first place. That moment, what he saw, what he thought, remains beyond recovery. Theories keep it alive because they fill the gap left by that missing minute between calm and fear. In that space, listeners hear what they want: pursuit, accident, madness, or something stranger. The 911 call ensures that no single answer can ever silence the rest. As of today, no additional evidence has emerged. The family has accepted the findings, the department has closed its file, and the town has returned to quiet. Yet every few months, a new online voice replays the tape, analyzes the static, and reopens the question. The case continues, not as investigation, but as ritual people listening to an old call from a dark field, trying to hear something more than static. In the end, the theories persist because the sound never truly ends. The wind still moves across the grass near the bridge, and to anyone who stops there at night, it carries the same broken rhythm: a voice half heard, a sentence unfinished, a question still suspended in the air. The unfinished map. Every search for Brandon Lawson began with a map: simple lines drawn across a screen, trying to translate a vast, uneven landscape into squares and coordinates. Yet from the first hours of the search, the map itself became part of the problem. The terrain north of Bronte refused to fit into the neat geometry of a search grid. Creeks cut through fields at odd angles, fences divided property lines, and private gates restricted access. What looked manageable on paper proved labyrinthine on the ground. On the morning of the 9th of August 2013, the Coke County Sheriff's Office printed its first working map. It showed Highway 277, the Colorado River, and a red circle around the bridge where Brandon's truck had been found. Deputies divided the area into 4 sectors: North Pasture, Riverbend, Eastfield, and Roadside. The intention was clear cover each systematically, log progress, and overlap only at the borders. But as the day went on, the paper grid began to fall apart. Some ranches denied entry, citing livestock or liability. Other parcels belonged to absentee owners who couldn't be reached. Volunteers, unsure where boundaries lay, avoided gates and focused on visible trails. The effect was a patchwork of effort. Certain stretches scoured repeatedly, while others, only yards away, remained untouched. Later records showed that the exact spot where Brandon's remains were found lay just outside one of those early sectors. A small bend in the fence had shifted the property line by less than 20 feet, leaving that section unsearched. The maps also failed to capture vertical variation. What appeared flat from above was a terrain of hidden gullies, dry creek beds, and shallow depressions. Deputies walked in straight lines, but each line rose and fell over uneven ground, creating blind zones invisible to anyone standing more than a few feet away. When helicopters passed overhead that first week, their infrared cameras read the landscape as uniform heat, nothing but the glow of sun-warmed grass. From above, the field seemed empty. Volunteer groups tried to compensate by drawing their own maps. One, made by a local firefighter, used Jeep's waypoints to mark completed sweeps. Another relied on grid tape, stretched between fence posts. These improvised systems worked in isolation, but lacked central coordination. Data from one group rarely reached the next. By the end of the first week, 5 different maps existed, none matching perfectly. When investigators later compared them, gaps appeared like missing puzzle pieces, narrow strips of land that nobody had covered. Weather added another layer of confusion. Rain on the third night washed away footprints and softened soil, erasing signs that could have guided trackers. Satellite images taken later showed fresh growth where the rain pooled, further disguising low areas. The Lawson search area became less a single place and more a collection of overlapping approximations. Over the years, as new volunteers joined, they inherited those errors. Most relied on archived maps, shared online scans of scans, pixelated and distorted. Jeep's coordinates from early reports sometimes placed landmarks several meters off their true location. A misplaced decimal could shift a search zone by hundreds of feet. That was all it took. In 2014, a drone survey attempted to correct the problem. Using thermal imaging, volunteers traced the land's contours and overlaid them onto county plats. The result was a 3D map showing the subtle slope toward the river, the very trough that had hidden Brandon's remains. The map was accurate, but released too late. Funding for further aerial searches had already expired. Privately, investigators acknowledged that mapping failures haunted the case. One ranger wrote, "The land here doesn't forgive small mistakes. Miss one corner, and you might as well miss the whole thing." The sheriff's office later adopted stricter protocols requiring GIS mapping and real-time tracking of searches, but those improvements came years after the fact. When the field was finally searched again in 2022, technology revealed what the early maps had missed: a small depression running parallel to the highway, obscured by thorn brush and waist-high grass. The coordinates placed it within yards of the original grid boundary. The map had ended just short of the truth. Cartographers often say that maps are stories about control attempts to draw order around the unpredictable. In the Lawson case, the map became the opposite, a record of limits. It showed how easily information fragments, when stretched across miles of quiet land, every misplaced line reflected the difference between visibility and disappearance. Even today, the archived maps remain incomplete. Some are marked with orange highlighter, others with penciled notes that fade toward the edges. On one, a faint arrow points toward the area where the remains were found. The handwriting reads simply, "Unreachable terrain." That phrase sums up not just geography, but the entire investigation. The field resisted mapping, as if its shape changed subtly between visits. Searchers who returned years later swore landmarks had shifted, the fence post gone, the gully deeper, the river bend wider. The land had redrawn itself in silence, covering what had always been there. The story of Brandon Lawson is inseparable from those maps. How a few lines missed what was hidden in plain sight. How boundaries meant to guide, instead delayed discovery. The maps remain, each a snapshot of what people thought they understood. And between their overlapping borders lies the narrow space where one man disappeared for nearly a decade. The last transmission, when the Coke County Sheriff's Office officially closed the Brandon Lawson case, it did so with 2 short sentences typed on a single sheet of paper. Remains positively identified as Lawson Brandon, case status, closed. Beneath that, a signature, a date, and nothing else. After 9 years of confusion, speculation, and unanswered questions, the official record ended quietly. Yet outside those files, beyond the typed summary, the silence only deepened. Brandon's story had started as an ordinary emergency. A truck, a stretch of road, a phone call. What made it last nearly a decade was everything that came after the absence of him, the fragments left behind, and the sound of a voice still echoing through a line that went dead before dawn. Even now, it is that voice that defines the case. The last known moments of Brandon Lawson's life exist entirely in sound. The 43-second 911 call recorded at 12:50 a.m. on the 9th of August 2013, has been slowed, filtered, captioned, and replayed countless times. Its words vary depending on who listens. I ran into them. There's one car here. Please hurry. Between those phrases are breaths, static, and wind. No one knows what he saw or who he thought was chasing him. The call ends mid-sentence. The dispatcher's "okay, stay on the line," fading into the hum of open air. For years, that was all investigators had. A truck abandoned on Highway 277 near Bronte. No damage, no footprints leading away, no sign of struggle. Then came 9 years of search grids, river sweeps, and unanswered tips until 2022, when a private search team finally found his remains only a few hundred feet from where the truck had been left. He had been there all along, hidden in a shallow depression behind the fence. The conclusion, on paper, was simple. Likely death by exposure, no signs of foul play. But the simplicity of the words clashed with the complexity of the story. People struggled to accept that a man could vanish that close to help, could call for rescue, and yet remain unseen. The explanations, drug influence, paranoia, exhaustion, never felt large enough to hold what was recorded in his voice. Inside the sheriff's archive, the final case binder is thin. Its pages include the 911 transcript, the property maps, and the lab confirmation of DNA. On the back of the last page, in pen, an investigator had written one sentence not meant for the record. He was trying to be found. That line, informal and human, carries the weight of everything official language could not express. When the remains were returned to his family in April 2022, there were no television cameras, no memorial beside the highway. Just a small service in San Angelo, attended by relatives, a few friends, and 1 or 2 deputies who had searched the field years before. The obituary listed only the dates 1986 to 2013 and a quiet acknowledgement. He was loved by many and missed by all. After the service, Kyle Lawson drove north, stopping by the bridge where it had begun. He stood at the guardrail for a long time, saying nothing. To those who lived through the search, the field feels almost alive, a flat, open plain that nevertheless swallows light and sound. The grass changes with the seasons, but the stillness does not. Deputies who worked the original search say the place alters one's sense of distance. A shout dies after 30 yards, footsteps fade too quickly. One recalled standing there in the dark and realizing how easy it would be for someone to vanish simply by crouching. "You don't see it," he said. "You hear it, and then it's gone." When reporters asked, years later, why the case had lingered so long, the sheriff answered carefully, "We found what was there to find." But even he admitted the discomfort of its nearness. You don't expect 9 years of questions to end 100 yards from where they started. For investigators, the outcome brought relief. For the public, it introduced a new kind of unease. If Brandon could disappear in a place that small, anyone could. Online, the story never ended. Each year, new forums appeared, revisiting the call, the timeline, the inconsistencies. Some saw evidence of a cover-up. Others clung to theories of hidden pursuit. When the confirmation of remains was released, many reacted not with closure, but disbelief. "Found doesn't mean explained," one commenter wrote, echoing the sentiment that had followed the case since the beginning. The Lawson family learned to live with that dissonance between what they knew and what they would never know. For Ledessa, silence became a form of protection. After early interviews, she withdrew from public view, focusing on her children. When asked later about the final discovery, she said only, "It's over for us. That's enough." Kyle continued to revisit the site occasionally, leaving small tokens at the fence line. A note, a cross, once a folded map of the search grid marked with an X over the discovery point. Each visitor to that bridge remarks on the same thing: the sound. On calm days, wind moves through the grass like low static. When cars pass, the vibration travels through the guardrail, humming faintly, almost like the background of the recording. For those who know the story, it feels less like coincidence than continuity. The field has become the recording's physical echo, a place where sound and silence overlap. In a wider sense, Brandon Lawson's case changed how Texas law enforcement treats rural disappearances. New dispatch protocols, updated mapping software, and faster response guidelines all trace back to lessons learned from that night. The Lawson procedure, as some departments call it, requires that any unclear 911 call from a moving or rural signal tower trigger an automatic dual response, both local and state. It is a small legacy built from a large absence. Yet even with procedural reform, the emotional residue remains. For searchers, it's the memory of walking in circles beneath a vast, indifferent sky. For dispatchers, it's the tone of a man trying to hold panic inside reason. For the family, it's a voice they cannot unhear. And for everyone else, the countless strangers who found the case online, it's the uneasy realization that technology, vigilance, and good intentions still fail sometimes, leaving silence in their wake. Standing on Highway 277 today, nothing marks the event. The grass grows thick where his truck once idled. The fence is bent where searchers climbed through. Beyond it, the depression where he lay is indistinguishable from the rest of the terrain. The field returned to its normal state, open, indifferent, and eternal. The only sound is the wind. If you listen closely, it almost resembles the faint hum on the recording, the last transmission that connected one frightened man to the world beyond him. No one ever found out what he saw, or who he thought was out there, or whether anyone else stood in that field. But the call remains, looping endlessly online, reminding listeners that sometimes the only record of a life's final moment is a voice asking for help, half swallowed by static. Brandon Lawson's story ends not with revelation, but with acknowledgement. The field gave him back, but not his truth. The case is closed, yet the questions linger in the same quiet air that carried his last words. And somewhere, in that eternal gap between sound and silence, a signal still travels, a man still trying to be found, a voice still speaking across the static, unanswered, but not entirely gone. The case of Brandon Lawson may be closed on paper, but the silence around it remains. A man vanished within sight of a highway, within reach of help, and for nearly a decade, no one could explain why. Even after his discovery, the gaps in time, the missing minutes, the broken transmission refused to fade. Some say it was panic, others believe something else happened in that field. But the truth lies somewhere between the static and the dark, in a space no report can fully describe. If you followed this story to the end, take a moment to remember that behind every mystery like this are families still searching and questions still unanswered. Join us next time as we explore more cases that ended in silence but never truly ended at all. Subscribe, stay curious, and keep listening, because sometimes the quietest stories are the ones that stay with us the longest.